The plane was ready for takeoff, passengers settling into their seats, when suddenly a flight attendant stopped in front of two young boys in first class. Her expression tightened. Moments later, they were being escorted off the plane, humiliated in front of everyone. No explanation, no warning, just gone. But what she didn't know? The mistake she just made would come back to haunt her in a way she never saw coming. And by the time she realized the truth, it was already too late. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new one. The airport was alive with movement, travelers rushing between terminals, rolling suitcases gliding across polished floors, and the distant sound of boarding announcements filling the air. Among the crowd, Airl and his younger brother Xavier made their way toward their gate, their backpacks slung over their shoulders. The two boys had been buzzing with excitement ever since their father surprised them with first-class tickets for their trip. It was a reward for their hard work in school, something they had never expected but were thrilled about. Airl, the older of the two at 15, carried himself with quiet confidence. He was used to looking after Xavier, who at 13 had a boundless energy that made every moment an adventure. As they reached the boarding area, Airl handed both their tickets to the gate agent. The woman scanned them without a second glance and gave them a polite nod. "You're all set. Enjoy your flight." They stepped into the jet bridge, feeling a thrill as they approached the plane. The cool air inside the aircraft was a welcome relief from the crowded terminal. The scent of fresh coffee lingered in the air, and the hum of quiet conversations filled the first-class cabin. Airl checked their seat numbers, 2A and 2B, and guided Xavier toward their seats. The moment they settled in, Xavier grinned, already reaching for the in-flight entertainment screen. "This is crazy," Xavier whispered, pressing buttons excitedly. "We've never had seats this big before." Airl smirked, adjusting his armrest. "Yeah, well, we earned it." As passengers continued boarding, a flight attendant walked down the aisle checking seat numbers. Meliora Cartwright had been working flights for over 15 years. She prided herself on efficiency, on making sure things ran smoothly. She wasn't the warmest crew member, but she knew how to keep order. Her sharp eyes scanned the cabin, ensuring everything was in place. Then she saw them, two boys, alone, seated comfortably in first class. She stopped walking. Something about the sight made her pause. She stepped closer, arms crossed. "Excuse me," she said, her tone polite but firm. "Are you two in the right seats?" Airl looked up, caught off guard. "Yes, we have first-class tickets." Meliora's eyes flicked over them, skepticism evident on her face. "Where are your parents?" Xavier blinked. "We're traveling alone," he answered. Her lips pressed together. "I see." Airl reached into his hoodie pocket, pulling out his boarding pass. "Here," he said, handing it over. Xavier did the same. Meliora took the tickets, glancing at them, but something in her expression remained doubtful. She held on to them longer than necessary, flipping them over, inspecting them again. Then, without a word, she handed them back. "I'll be right back," she said before turning and walking toward the front of the cabin. Airl frowned, watching her go. "That was weird," he muttered under his breath. Xavier shifted in his seat. "Why do I feel like she doesn't believe us?" Passengers around them had noticed the interaction. Some exchanged glances. Others kept their heads down, pretending not to hear. The first-class cabin, which had felt welcoming just moments ago, suddenly felt different. A few minutes later, Meliora returned, this time with another crew member, Bennett, the senior flight attendant. He walked with a sense of authority, but his expression was unreadable. "We need you both to come with us," Meliora said, her voice louder this time. Airl sat up straighter. "Why? What's wrong?" "There's been a mistake with your seating," she said, her patience thinning. "You need to move." Xavier's face fell. "But we have first-class tickets," he repeated, his voice smaller this time. Bennett cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. "Boys, let's not make this difficult," Elian clenched his fists, anger bubbling beneath the surface. He knew arguing wouldn't help, so he inhaled deeply and grabbed his backpack. Xavian hesitated before doing the same. As they stood, the energy in the cabin shifted. People watched but said nothing. Some passengers avoided looking at them altogether. Others stole glances but quickly returned to their magazines or phones. Meliora led them down the aisle toward the exit. Her posture stiff, her face unreadable. Elian and Xavian walked past the rows of passengers, feeling every stare. The moment they stepped off the plane, a member of the ground staff, Lydia, was already waiting for them. "Step aside, please," Lydia instructed, motioning them toward a nearby seating area. The second they were off the plane, Xavian pulled out his phone and typed a quick message with shaky fingers. "Xavian, they made us leave our seats, said there was a mistake, but we had our tickets." He hit send, his stomach twisting. A reply came almost instantly. "Dad, what flight number?" Elian read the message and exhaled slowly. "He's going to be mad," he muttered. Xavian nodded. "Really mad." Inside the plane, Meliora returned to the first-class cabin, dusting off her hands as if she had just handled a small inconvenience. She glanced at Bennett, giving a short nod. "Problem solved," she said. She didn't know that the decision she had just made was about to change everything. The airport terminal felt colder than before. Elian and Xavian sat in stiff chairs near the gate, their backpacks resting at their feet. A steady stream of passengers moved through the terminal, some rushing to catch flights, others waiting around, unaware of what had just happened to them. Xavian kept looking at his phone, waiting for another message from their father. Elian, on the other hand, sat quietly, jaw clenched, replaying everything in his head. "She didn't even check properly," Xavian muttered. His fingers drummed anxiously against his leg. "She just looked at us and decided we didn't belong." Elian let out a slow breath, his mind working through the situation. "She didn't even question anyone else in first class," he pointed out. "Just us." Xavian's grip on his phone tightened. "Do you think Dad is going to—" Before he could finish, his phone vibrated in his hands. He quickly unlocked it and read the new message. "Dad, stay where you are. I'm handling it." Elian read over Xavian's shoulder, then leaned back in his seat. "That means she's in trouble." Xavian smirked slightly. "Good." Back inside the plane, Meliora Cartwright moved through the first-class cabin, checking overhead bins and adjusting small details. To her, the situation was already behind her. She had followed her instinct, and as far as she was concerned, that was the end of it. She glanced at the passengers she had spoken to earlier, offering a professional smile. "Apologies for the delay," she said smoothly. "We had to clear up a seating issue, but everything is taken care of now." A few passengers nodded politely, though some still looked curious. A woman in seat 3D, an older lady dressed in a navy blue blazer, frowned slightly. "Were they not supposed to be here?" she asked. Meliora straightened her posture. "It was just a misunderstanding," she said quickly. The woman didn't seem convinced but said nothing more. At the front of the plane, Captain Aldrich Vaughn was reviewing flight details with his co-pilot when the in-flight phone beside him rang. He picked it up, expecting a routine check-in. Instead, a low, serious voice spoke on the other end. "This is Dorian Vance, Executive Manager of Airline Operations. We just received a direct call from the CEO's office." Aldrich's grip on the receiver tightened slightly. "Go ahead." "Did a flight attendant just remove 2 unaccompanied minors from first class?" Aldrich glanced at the cabin door, suddenly aware of how quiet things had gotten outside. He had been briefed about unaccompanied minors traveling on the flight, but hadn't been informed of any seating issues. "I wasn't aware of any removal," Aldrich admitted. "Well, it happened," Dorian said, his tone clipped. "And the CEO himself is on his way to the airline's operations center right now." Aldrich's eyes narrowed. "The CEO?" "Yes," Dorian confirmed. "Darius Langford and those 2 boys, they're his sons." A brief, heavy silence followed. Aldrich leaned back in his seat, exhaling slowly. This wasn't just a mistake. This was a disaster. Who was responsible for this? Aldrich asked. The report says a senior flight attendant, Meliora Cartwright. Aldrich nodded. He had worked with her before, efficient, experienced, unbending. Put me through to her, he said. Dorian didn't hesitate. Already done. You'll want to handle this quickly. Aldrich set down the receiver and pressed the button for the in-flight announcement system. His voice came over the speakers, steady but firm. Ms. Cartwright, report to the cockpit immediately. Meliora paused mid-step. A few passengers looked up at the announcement. For the first time all morning, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. A flicker of doubt. She turned on her heel and made her way toward the front of the plane, straightening her uniform as she walked. She had no idea what was waiting for her behind that door. But she was about to find out. Meliora stepped into the cockpit, the door shutting behind her with a quiet click. Captain Aldrich Vaughn sat in his chair, his posture straighter than usual, his expression unreadable. The tension in the room was thick. He didn't greet her like he normally would. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped together. Ms. Cartwright, he began, his tone sharp but controlled. I need an explanation. Meliora kept her back straight, her years of experience making it easy to mask the unease creeping into her chest. Sir, there was a seating issue in first class, she said evenly. 2 unaccompanied minors were in premium seats. Given the circumstances, I made the call to remove them and reassign their seating. Aldrich's eyes didn't leave hers. And what circumstances were those? Meliora hesitated just for a second, but she covered it quickly. They were alone, she answered. It seemed out of place. I wasn't informed of any minors traveling in first class, and I had to act quickly. Aldrich let out a slow breath. Did you check the manifest? Her stomach twisted. Yes or no, Ms. Cartwright? Her lips parted slightly, but no answer came. Aldrich's jaw tightened. Did you verify their tickets with the gate agent? Another pause. Meliora suddenly felt the air in the cockpit grow heavier. I looked at the tickets, she said, her voice quieter now. But Aldrich shook his head. You didn't verify, you assumed. Meliora's throat went dry. Aldrich didn't raise his voice, but his words carried weight. The 2 passengers you removed from first class were Kenzo Eliane Langford and Xavian Darius Langford. Do you know who their father is? Her pulse quickened. Darius Langford, the CEO of this airline. A cold chill ran down Meliora's spine. Aldrich continued, his voice like steel. Right now, Darius Langford is personally reviewing this situation. You have single-handedly created an incident that will not only affect this flight, but could result in severe consequences for the airline. Meliora swallowed hard, but the dryness in her throat made it difficult. Aldrich's next words came slowly, deliberately. You will return to the boys, personally apologize, and escort them back to their original seats in first class. Immediately. She opened her mouth, ready to argue, to say she had only been doing her job. But the look in Aldrich's eyes told her this wasn't up for debate. Do I make myself clear? Meliora clenched her fists at her sides but forced a nod. Yes, Captain. Then fix your mistake, he said, turning away from her. She felt the heat in her face as she turned on her heel, stepping out of the cockpit. The moment the door shut behind her, she let out a slow breath, her hands slightly trembling. Passengers continued settling in, oblivious to what had just happened behind the cockpit door. But Meliora felt it, the shift. For the first time in her career, she wasn't in control of the situation, and she had no idea what was waiting for her when the plane landed. Meliora walked stiffly down the aisle, her heart pounding in a way it hadn't in years. She had handled difficult passengers, strict supervisors, and high-pressure situations before, but nothing compared to this. The moment she stepped back into the first-class cabin, she could feel the shift in energy. Some passengers had heard the announcement from the captain. Others had noticed the way she had walked 2 young boys off the plane just minutes ago. And now they were watching her, waiting to see what would happen next. Xavian sat with his arms crossed, staring down at his phone, while Eliane sat upright, his expression unreadable. They hadn't spoken much since their father's message. but they knew something was happening. Meliora stopped in front of them, forcing a tight smile. She crouched slightly to meet their eye level, her voice quieter than before. "There's been a misunderstanding," she said, her tone measured but strained. "I'd like to escort you both back to your original seats in first class." Xavian looked up from his phone, his eyebrows raising slightly. "Now you want us to come back?" Elian studied her closely. "What changed?" Meliora's jaw tightened. "It was an error in seating," she said quickly, avoiding eye contact. "I apologize for the inconvenience." Xavian blinked, tilting his head. "A mistake?" he repeated. "But you saw our tickets." Elian didn't let her off easily. "You didn't ask anyone else for their ticket," he pointed out. "Just us." The cabin was quiet now. Passengers were listening. Some had shifted slightly in their seats, glancing at one another, pretending not to be interested while hanging on to every word. Meliora pressed her lips together. She had been in control for years, never second-guessed, never questioned. But now, she was standing in front of two boys who weren't letting her escape the weight of her decision. "I may have misjudged the situation," she admitted, forcing herself to stay composed. "But I'd like to correct it now." Elian exchanged a glance with Xavian before looking back at her. "You didn't just misjudge," he said evenly. "You embarrassed us in front of everyone." Meliora swallowed. The heat in her face returned. She wanted to end this conversation quickly, to move past it, to act like it never happened. But the moment was stretching longer than she had anticipated. Passengers were no longer pretending to ignore them. A woman in seat 3D shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting between Meliora and the boys. A man in seat 4A adjusted his tie, clearing his throat. The uncomfortable truth had settled over the cabin. Everyone had seen what happened, and no one had spoken up. Xavian leaned back slightly, crossing his arms. "Dad told us to take our time," he said casually, looking at Elian. "So maybe we shouldn't be in a hurry." Elian smirked slightly. "Yeah," he agreed. "Maybe we should make sure we actually belong here first." Meliora clenched her jaw, forcing her voice to stay level. "I understand if you're upset," she said, choosing her words carefully. "But I need you both to return to your seats now." Xavian held up his phone. "Maybe I should ask Dad first." That made her stomach tighten. Passengers murmured now, whispers carrying across the rows. They knew. Meliora exhaled sharply and took a small step back. "Of course," she said stiffly. "I'll give you a moment." She turned on her heel and walked toward the galley, her hands cold and clammy. She had never felt like this before, completely powerless. Meanwhile, Elian leaned toward Xavian. "Send him a message," he said quietly. Xavian nodded, typing quickly. "Xavian, she wants us to come back. What do we do?" Seconds later, their father's response came. "Dad, make sure she understands what she did." Elian smirked, sliding his phone into his pocket. "Guess we're not in a hurry after all." And just like that, the power had shifted. Meliora stood in the galley, gripping the edge of the counter, her breathing shallow. She could still feel the eyes of the passengers on her, their whispers carrying through the cabin like an invisible weight pressing down on her. She had always been the one enforcing the rules, the one who kept things running the way they should. But now, for the first time in her career, she wasn't the one in control. Across the cabin, Elian and Xavian remained seated in the economy section, making no effort to rush back. Elian leaned back against his chair, tapping his fingers against the armrest, while Xavian scrolled through his phone with a smug expression. Neither of them was in a hurry. Xavian glanced at his screen and chuckled. "He's still texting." Elian smirked slightly. "What did he say?" Xavian read the message out loud. "Dad, she made a decision. Now she needs to live with it. Don't move until she actually apologizes." Elian raised an eyebrow. "Not just an apology, an actual apology." Xavian grinned. "I like his style." Meanwhile, in the galley, Halima, a younger flight attendant who had been observing the entire situation, hesitated before stepping closer to Meliora. "Are you okay?" she asked cautiously. Meliora shot her a sharp glance. I don't need your concern, Halima. Halima held up her hands in surrender. I was just asking. She leaned against the counter, watching Meliora closely. You know, this isn't going away, right? Meliora turned away, pretending to be busy organizing a tray. It was a misunderstanding, she muttered. Halima scoffed. Misunderstanding? You didn't question a single other person in first class. Just them. Meliora's grip on the tray tightened. Let me guess, Halima continued. You thought they didn't belong. You assumed something. Meliora didn't respond. Halima sighed, shaking her head. I've worked under you long enough to know you don't like being wrong, but this is a whole different level of bad. Meliora set the tray down with a little too much force. I already spoke to them. And how did that go? Halima asked, folding her arms. Meliora shot her a glare before turning toward the aisle. I'll handle it. Halima watched her go, muttering under her breath, Not the way you think you will. Meliora straightened her uniform and walked back down the aisle toward Elian and Xavian. The boys looked up as she approached, but neither of them moved. She cleared her throat. Are you ready to return to your seats? Elian leaned back, his arms resting comfortably on the armrests. Are you ready to actually apologize? Meliora stiffened. I already said it was a misunderstanding. Xavian raised an eyebrow. That's not an apology. Meliora exhaled sharply, glancing around at the watching passengers. She hated this. She hated feeling like she had lost control of the situation. But she could see it clearly now. Their father's message had given them the upper hand, and they weren't going to budge until she did this the right way. Forcing herself to keep her voice even, she met their gaze. I shouldn't have assumed you weren't supposed to be in first class, she admitted. I was wrong. I apologize, Xavian tilted his head. For what exactly? Meliora clenched her jaw. For questioning your tickets, for making you leave your seats. Elian nodded, finally pushing himself up from his chair. That's better. Xavian stood as well, adjusting his backpack. Took you long enough. The flight was silent as they walked back through the aisle, every pair of eyes following them. This time the passengers didn't ignore them. They saw everything. As they reached their first-class seats, Elian settled in, adjusting the seatbelt. Xavian leaned toward him, whispering, Dad's going to love this update. Meliora turned to leave, but Elian's voice stopped her. Oh, and Miss Cartwright? She turned, her expression stiff. Elian's voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the weight behind his words. If you're going to apologize, make sure it's not just because you got caught. Meliora held his gaze for a second longer before turning away, her face burning. For the first time in her career, she wasn't the one giving orders. And she hated it. Meliora walked briskly back toward the galley, her heart hammering in her chest. Every step felt heavier than the last. She knew the moment she turned around, the whispers would start again. The passengers had seen everything. They had witnessed her make a snap decision, humiliate two boys, and then be forced to backtrack when she realized who they were. She reached the galley and leaned against the counter, inhaling deeply. Halima was still there, watching with an amused expression. So, how'd that go? Meliora shot her a sharp look. Not now, Halima smirked. I'll take that as a terribly. Meliora ignored her and grabbed a stack of cups, pretending to busy herself, but her hands were trembling. Halima leaned against the counter, folding her arms. You still don't get it, do you? Meliora exhaled slowly, willing herself to stay calm. I handled the situation. Halima raised an eyebrow. You think this is handled? She scoffed. You pulled two kids out of first class based on nothing but your own assumptions. Then you made them walk back through the cabin like they had done something wrong. And now, you think an apology is enough to erase that? Meliora pressed her lips together, not answering. Halima didn't let up. The fact that they had to demand an apology tells you everything you need to know. Meliora turned her back on her, pretending to organize napkins. I don't need a lecture. Halima let out a dry laugh. Oh, you're going to get one whether you like it or not. She tilted her head toward the first-class section. Because you know who else isn't going to let this slide? Meliora didn't have to ask. She already knew. Darius Langford. She could still feel the heat rising in her cheeks. A mistake like this, on any other flight, might have been brushed aside, dismissed with a simple report and a warning. But this mistake involved the CEO's sons, and the entire company was about to find out about it. Meanwhile, back in first class, Xavier pulled out his phone, his fingers moving quickly over the screen. Ilian glanced at him and smirked. Updating him? Xavier nodded. Of course. Xavier. She finally apologized. Took her long enough. A few seconds later, their father's reply came through. Dad. Good. Sit back and relax. I'm handling the rest. Ilian raised an eyebrow as he read the message over Xavier's shoulder. That doesn't sound good. For her, I mean. Xavier grinned. Nope, not at all. At the front of the plane, the in-flight phone buzzed. Meliora froze. The other flight attendants turned toward her, their expressions wary. Halima gave a slow nod. That'll be him. Meliora's stomach twisted as she reached for the phone. Her hand was unsteady as she lifted the receiver to her ear. A deep, calm voice came through the line. This is Darius Langford. Meliora's breath caught in her throat. You and I need to talk. Meliora swallowed hard, gripping the phone tightly. The hum of the aircraft felt distant now, drowned out by the weight of the voice on the other end. Darius Langford didn't sound angry. He didn't need to. His tone was calm, measured, the kind of calm that carried more danger than yelling ever could. Mr. Langford, she started, forcing her voice to remain steady. You removed my sons from first class without checking their tickets properly. Darius interrupted smoothly. You didn't verify anything. You assumed. Meliora felt her throat tighten. Sir, I understand that. You don't, he cut in. If you did, this conversation wouldn't be happening. A heavy silence stretched between them. Meliora's fingers clenched around the phone cord. She had faced difficult passengers before, strict supervisors, even demanding executives. But this was different. This wasn't someone looking for an excuse or a scripted response. This was the man who owned the airline demanding accountability. I've already apologized to them, she said, trying to regain some control. I escorted them back to first class. Darius let out a slow, unimpressed breath. And? Meliora blinked. And? You think that's enough? Darius asked, his voice unreadable. You think a forced apology fixes what you did? Meliora felt the pressure building in her chest. It was a mistake, she said, voice quieter now. A misjudgment. No, Darius corrected. It was a choice. Meliora flinched slightly. You didn't ask anyone else to prove they belonged in first class, Darius continued. Just them. You didn't check the manifest. You didn't call the gate agent. You didn't even stop to consider that you were the one who made a mistake. Meliora remained silent. There was nothing she could say that would make it sound better. My sons don't need your approval to sit in first class, Darius said, his voice lower now. They had their tickets. They followed the rules. You're the one who didn't. Meliora felt her breath turn shallow. She never felt this way. She had been in the industry for 15 years. She knew every policy, every regulation, and yet here she was, exposed. Do you understand what happens next? Darius asked. Meliora's mouth felt dry. Mr. Langford, I assure you, you're going to file a full incident report the moment this flight lands, he said, his voice sharp. Not an excuse, not a scripted apology, a report. I want to see exactly what went through your head when you decided my sons didn't belong in those seats. Meliora's heart pounded. Sir, And then, Darius continued, his voice dropping to a cold finality. You're going to explain yourself in front of the executive board. The blood drained from her face. The same board that determines whether or not you keep your job, Darius added. Meliora's stomach plummeted. I suggest you use the rest of this flight to think very carefully about how you're going to justify what you did, Darius said. And then, click. The call ended. Meliora stood there, frozen, the receiver still pressed to her ear. The low hum of the disconnected line rang in her ears, but she couldn't move. Halima, who had been watching the entire time, raised an eyebrow. So, how'd that go? Meliora slowly placed the phone back onto the hook, her hands clammy. Without a word, she turned and walked straight to the nearest restroom, locking the door behind her. She gripped the sink, staring at her reflection in the mirror. Her face was pale. For the first time, the reality of what she had done truly sank in. She had humiliated the sons of the most powerful man in the airline industry, and now she had to answer for it. Meliora splashed cold water on her face, gripping the edges of the small sink inside the lavatory. Her reflection stared back at her, but for the first time, she didn't recognize the confident, in-control flight attendant she had always been. She had made a mistake, a serious one, and now, the weight of it was pressing down on her like never before. She had thought an apology would be enough to smooth things over, that a quiet return to first class would end the matter. But it hadn't. Darius Langford wasn't letting this go. And deep down, she knew why. This wasn't just about his sons. This was about every passenger she had judged unfairly over the years. Every moment when she had let her assumptions dictate her decisions. The only difference this time, she had picked the wrong people to treat unfairly. A sharp knock on the door made her flinch. Meliora? It was Bennett, the senior flight attendant. We need you back out here. She swallowed, steadying her breath before unlocking the door. When she stepped out, Bennett's expression was unreadable, but there was a tension in his eyes that hadn't been there before. We just got word from ground control, he said in a low voice, leading her away from the other flight attendants. Security is waiting at the gate when we land. Meliora's stomach twisted violently. Security? She echoed, her voice barely above a whisper. Bennett nodded. Not for an emergency, but for an escort. He hesitated before adding, for you. She stared at him. Bennett glanced around, lowering his voice even more. Langford made a personal request. Meliora's breath hitched. A personal request. That meant this wasn't going to be handled quietly. This was serious. How bad is this? She asked, forcing her voice to stay level. Bennett exhaled. They're calling a review hearing immediately after we land. That doesn't happen unless the company is considering serious action. Meliora felt her throat close up. She had been with the airline for 15 years. She had given everything to this job. And now it could all be gone because of one moment. One assumption she hadn't thought twice about until it was too late. She turned her gaze toward the first-class cabin. Elian and Xavian were completely at ease, lounging in their seats, scrolling through their phones. They weren't gloating. They weren't even looking in her direction, but they didn't have to. They had already won. Halima stepped closer, her arms crossed as she studied Meliora's face. Starting to sink in now, isn't it? Meliora clenched her jaw. I'll handle it, Halima scoffed. Handle it? She shook her head. You still don't get it. This isn't about handling it. This is about what happens when someone with real power decides to hold you accountable. Meliora's fingers curled into fists at her sides. She wasn't used to feeling powerless, but here she was, completely trapped in the consequences of her own actions. The worst part? She had done this to herself. Bennett glanced at his watch. We land in 30 minutes. You should probably start thinking about what you're going to say. Meliora nodded stiffly, but her mind was already racing. For the first time in her career, she wasn't sure there was anything she could say to fix this. The final 30 minutes of the flight felt like the longest of Meliora's career. Every second dragged, her mind running through possible explanations, excuses, or ways to soften the damage. But the reality was suffocating. There was no way out of this. She stood near the galley, gripping the counter, staring blankly at the service card in front of her. Halima, Bennett, and the rest of the crew knew what was coming. No one said it out loud, but she could feel it in their stolen glances. in the way they moved around her like she was already gone. Over the intercom, Captain Aldrich's voice came through, calm but firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our descent. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and tray tables are in their upright positions. We will be landing shortly." Meliora inhaled sharply. 20 minutes. She glanced toward first class. Elian and Xavier sat comfortably, their expressions unreadable. They hadn't spoken to her since she brought them back to their seats. But she could feel them watching. Not out of spite, not out of anger, but with the quiet confidence of knowing they had already won. Xavier leaned toward his brother, whispering something before unlocking his phone. Meliora's stomach dropped when she saw him type another message. She knew who he was texting, Darius Langford, and she had no doubt that whatever he was telling their father would only make things worse for her. A few rows back, a businessman in seat 4A adjusted his tie uncomfortably. He had been one of the many passengers who had watched everything unfold earlier, but had chosen to say nothing. Now, as Meliora passed him, he finally spoke. "I hope you learned something from this," he muttered, not even looking at her. Meliora stiffened. From across the aisle, the woman in seat 3D, the one who had questioned her earlier, shook her head. "The world is changing," she said quietly. "You should have changed with it." Meliora felt heat rush to her face. It wasn't just about Darius Langford anymore. Everyone on this flight knew what she had done. They weren't just waiting to see what happened to her when they landed. They were expecting it. The fastened seatbelt sign dinged on. Meliora moved stiffly back to the galley, gripping the edge of the counter so tightly her knuckles turned white. Halima stood beside her, arms crossed. "Still think you can handle it?" Meliora didn't answer, because for the first time in her career she didn't know if she could. The plane dipped lower as it prepared for landing, the soft hum of the engines filling the cabin. Passengers adjusted their seatbelts, some stretching, others peering out the windows to catch a glimpse of the approaching runway. For most of them, this was just another flight ending. But for Meliora, it was the beginning of the end. She stood in the galley, gripping the counter so tightly that her fingers ached. Every second that passed was another step closer to whatever punishment awaited her. She could already picture it. Walking off the plane, security waiting, the hushed whispers of airline staff as she was pulled aside. Would she be fired on the spot? Would she be given a chance to explain herself? There was nothing to explain. The reality of what she had done had finally settled into her bones. She had made a decision, not out of policy, not out of procedure, but out of assumption. And now, she was about to pay for it in front of everyone. From first class, Elian adjusted his seatbelt while keeping his phone in his lap, waiting for the final message from his father. Xavier, on the other hand, was enjoying himself. He smirked slightly as he scrolled through his phone, already imagining the scene that was about to unfold when they landed. "Think he's waiting for us?" Xavier asked, nudging his brother. Leon nodded. "Definitely, and I don't think he's alone." Xavier's grin widened. "Oof, she's about to have the worst day of her life." From the galley, Meliora overheard them. Her stomach twisted. Halima noticed the way Meliora's face paled, the way her body tensed at the sound of Xavier's voice. She let out a dry laugh, shaking her head. "You're scared." Meliora's eyes snapped to her. "I am not." Halima raised an eyebrow. "Really?" She gestured toward first class. "Because those two? They're not worried about a thing. They're sitting back, relaxing, knowing that their dad is about to handle this in a way you never saw coming." Meliora's pulse quickened. "I've been in difficult situations before." Halima tilted her head slightly. "And how many of those situations involved the man who owns the airline demanding an explanation for why you publicly humiliated his kids?" Meliora had no response. The cabin grew eerily silent as the plane made its final approach. Passengers straightened in their seats, gripping armrests as the aircraft hovered just above the runway. Then, a smooth landing. The wheels touched down with a gentle bounce, the engines roaring as the plane slowed. The overhead lights flickered slightly, and a few passengers let out relieved sighs. For most people on board, the flight was over. For Meliora, it was just beginning. The intercom crackled again. Captain Aldrich's voice came through, steady as ever. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our destination. Please remain seated until we reach the gate and the seatbelt sign is turned off. On behalf of the crew, thank you for flying with us today." As soon as the announcement ended, Meliora saw it. Through the small opening in the galley curtain, she could see the jet bridge moving into place, and standing just outside the window, a group of men in dark suits. Her breath caught in her throat. They weren't airport security. They weren't random executives. They were personal staff from the CEO's office, Darius Langford's men, waiting. Passengers in first class noticed too. The murmurs started instantly. Elian glanced out the window and smirked. Xavian let out a quiet chuckle. "Oh yeah," Xavian whispered. "She's done." The fasten seatbelt sign dinged off. The plane doors would open soon. And when they did, Meliora had nowhere to hide. Bennett walked up beside her, his face blank, his voice unreadable. "They're waiting for you." Meliora's pulse thundered in her ears. She forced herself to breathe. She had always thought she had power. She had always thought she was the one in charge. But she had never been more wrong. The moment the seatbelt sign turned off, a hush fell over the plane. Normally, this was the part where passengers rushed to stand, grabbing bags from the overhead bins, eager to leave. But this time, no one moved right away. Everyone felt something was about to happen. Meliora's hands were ice cold. She gripped the cart in the galley, steadying herself, forcing herself to think. What could she say? What defense could she possibly give when the man waiting for her owned the very company she worked for? Through the small window of the cabin door, she could see them standing just outside the jet bridge. 3 men in dark suits, arms crossed, earpieces in their ears. They weren't normal airline staff. They were Langford's people, and they were here for her. Passengers finally started standing, pulling bags down, stretching their legs. But even as they moved, their eyes kept darting toward the front of the plane. The tension was suffocating. Elian took his time unbuckling his seatbelt. He wasn't in a rush. Xavian, on the other hand, was already standing, casually rolling his shoulders like he was getting ready for a show. "I can't wait to see her face," Xavian muttered to his brother. Elian smirked. "She already knows." From the galley, Meliora heard them, and for the first time since this ordeal started, she felt something she hadn't before. Panic. Bennett appeared beside her, his expression unreadable. "You need to go out there." Meliora didn't move. Bennett exhaled sharply. "Look, avoiding it isn't going to change anything. You made a bad call. Now you have to face it." She clenched her jaw. "I was doing my job." Bennett gave her a long, exhausted look. "Were you?" Meliora's throat tightened. The cabin doors unlocked. A quiet hiss filled the air as the door cracked open and the jet bridge fully connected. A uniformed security officer stepped in first. Then, right behind him, came a man in a charcoal suit, calm and composed, his presence dominating the small entryway. The entire plane seemed to hold its breath. Meliora already knew who he was. Dorian Vance, Langford's right-hand man, the head of airline operations. The man who handled internal problems before they turned into public scandals. He was here for her. Dorian stepped forward, his sharp gaze sweeping the cabin before settling on Meliora. The second their eyes met, her stomach dropped. Passengers stared. Flight attendants held still. Dorian didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Ms. Cartwright," he said smoothly, his tone polite yet firm. "You'll need to come with us." Meliora's fingers clenched into fists at her sides. She felt every single eye in that cabin on her. Halima was watching, arms folded, expression unreadable. Bennett shifted uncomfortably beside her, but he didn't speak. And then there were the passengers. Some of them tried to pretend they weren't listening, keeping their heads down, scrolling on their phones. But others? They watched. The woman in seat 3D, the one who had questioned Meliora's actions earlier, pressed her lips together. The businessman in seat 4A, the one who had muttered at her before landing, shook his head slightly, his disappointment evident. They all knew what this was. Meliora had been judged, and now she was about to be sentenced. For a brief, desperate moment, she considered making a scene, arguing, defending herself, saying that she was just following procedure, that this was all a misunderstanding. But she knew it wouldn't matter. Dorian wasn't here for excuses. Without another word, Meliora stepped forward. The moment she did, whispers spread through the cabin like wildfire. This was it. She was being escorted off the plane. Passengers moved aside as she walked down the aisle. Some refused to meet her eyes. Others watched intently, murmuring among themselves. Eliane sat calmly, watching her pass without a word. Xavian, on the other hand, smirked slightly. Not out of cruelty, but because justice had been served. As Meliora reached the front of the plane, she hesitated. She turned slightly, glancing back at first class at the seats where the two boys sat, the seats that had been theirs all along. She had been so sure they didn't belong. And now, she was the one being forced to leave. Dorian motioned toward the jet bridge. "After you." With one final breath, Meliora stepped off the plane, and just like that, she was gone. The moment Meliora stepped off the plane, the cabin erupted into whispers. It was as if an unspoken tension had suddenly broken, a shift in energy that every passenger felt. Some exchanged glances, others murmured in hushed voices, piecing together what they had just witnessed. She had been removed, escorted off her own flight. Halima, still standing near the galley, let out a slow breath and shook her head. "Wow," she muttered under her breath. Bennett ran a hand down his face, exhaling. That was brutal. In first class, Eliane adjusted his watch, calm as ever. Xavian, however, was grinning. That, Xavian whispered, leaning toward his brother, was worth every second. Eliane smirked. She didn't see it coming. She thought she had power, Xavian said, shaking his head. But she didn't. Eliane tapped his fingers against the armrest. "Dad's not done yet." Xavian raised an eyebrow. "You think he'll fire her?" Eliane thought for a moment, then shrugged. "I think he'll make sure she never forgets this flight." Meanwhile, outside the plane, Meliora walked down the jet bridge, her heart pounding. She could feel Dorian Vance behind her, his presence heavy, his steps measured. He wasn't rushing her. He didn't need to. She had nowhere to go. At the end of the jet bridge, two more men in suits stood waiting. One held a tablet, the other a folder. Meliora's breath felt tight in her chest. This was happening. As soon as she reached the open terminal, Dorian stepped in front of her, blocking her path. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't look angry, but the authority in his expression was undeniable. "Ms. Cartwright," he said smoothly, "you will come with us to the executive office." Meliora forced herself to breathe. "Am I?" She swallowed, rephrasing. "Will I be given a chance to explain my side?" Dorian didn't blink. "You'll be given a chance to submit a formal statement, but I'd choose your words carefully." Meliora clenched her fists. "I've worked for this airline for 15 years. Dorian's expression didn't change. "And in a single flight, you damaged the company's reputation, alienated premium passengers, and made a decision that has now reached the highest level of corporate review." He tilted his head. "That's impressive in a way." Meliora felt her stomach drop. She had expected consequences. Maybe a suspension. Maybe a quiet reprimand. But this, she hadn't expected to become a public example. Dorian turned slightly, motioning toward the corridor. "Let's go." Meliora hesitated for a fraction of a second, but she knew she had no choice. Her career, her future, depended on what happened next. She walked forward. Dorian and the two suited men flanked her. They didn't touch her. They didn't push her. But the message was clear. She wasn't in control anymore. Back on the plane, the passengers were still talking about what had happened when the announcement came over the speakers. "This is your captain speaking. We have now reached the gate. The crew will begin deplaning shortly. Thank you for flying with us today." Xavian stretched his arms. "Guess it's time to go." Eliane nodded, standing up and grabbing his backpack. He glanced at the remaining flight attendants. None of them dared meet his eyes. As they walked toward the exit, a few passengers stepped aside, giving them space. Some even offered small nods of respect. It wasn't just about what had happened with Meliora. It was about what it represented. The silent, unspoken rule of the world was that people like them had to prove they belonged. That no matter how hard they worked, how much they earned, someone would always question whether they deserved to be there. Not today. Today, someone else had been forced to answer for their actions, and everyone saw it. As they stepped off the plane, a familiar figure stood waiting for them at the terminal entrance. Tall, commanding, dressed in a sleek charcoal suit, Darius Langford, their father. Xavian grinned. "Showtime." Elian smirked. "Let's see how this plays out." They walked forward, and the moment their father's eyes met theirs, they knew. This wasn't over yet. Darius Langford stood with his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable as his sons approached. His presence alone was enough to command attention. Sharp suit, precise posture, a quiet intensity that never needed to be loud to be heard. Behind him, several corporate executives and senior airline staff stood waiting, their faces tight with unease. They knew exactly why they were here. Elian and Xavian walked forward, their steps unhurried, carrying the same calmness their father did. They weren't nervous, they didn't have to be. The second they reached him, Darius took a long, measured look at both of them. "You good?" he asked simply. Elian nodded. "Yeah." Xavian smirked. "More than good." Darius held their gazes for another moment before turning his attention to the group of airline executives standing behind him. One of them, a nervous-looking man with silver-rimmed glasses, stepped forward. "Mr. Langford, we sincerely apologize for—" Darius held up a hand. The man immediately shut his mouth. A slow, heavy silence settled over the terminal. People were watching now. Not just airline staff, but passengers passing through. They stole glances from behind their phones, whispering among themselves. It wasn't every day the CEO of the airline personally showed up to handle a situation. Darius let the silence stretch before finally speaking. "Where is she?" The suited men exchanged uneasy glances. "She's on her way to the executive office," one of them answered carefully. Darius nodded once. "Good." He shifted his gaze toward his sons again, as if studying them for any signs of frustration or anger. But Elian and Xavian stood with the same calm, measured confidence he had taught them. Darius exhaled sharply, then spoke again, this time loud enough for everyone around him to hear. "I want to make something very clear," he said. "Not just to my staff, but to every person in this airport right now." The tension thickened instantly. "This isn't about two boys getting removed from their seats," he continued. "This is about the fact that no matter how much success, education, or wealth you have, there will always be someone who looks at you and decides, you don't belong here." A few of the executives shifted uncomfortably, but they didn't interrupt. Darius glanced toward his sons. "Today, that someone was one of my employees, and today, that someone learned that accountability applies to everyone." Xavian grinned. Elian smirked. They weren't just watching justice unfold. They were a part of it. Darius turned back to the executives. "I expect a full investigation into not just this incident, but the overall training of all crew members. I want a report on my desk by morning." His voice dropped slightly, dangerously controlled. "And if I find out that this wasn't an isolated issue, then the next person losing their job won't be a flight attendant. It'll be someone sitting in an office." No one spoke. They all knew better. Darius finally turned toward his sons again. "Let's go." With that, he walked past the executives, his sons following effortlessly at his side. They didn't need to hear any more. They had already won. Meanwhile, in the executive office, Meliora sat in a cold, modern conference room, her hands folded in her lap. Across from her, a long glass table stretched toward the far end of the room, where two senior airline officials sat flipping through a thick folder. Her folder. She could feel the weight of their judgment, the silent calculation behind their eyes. She wasn't just any flight attendant anymore. She was a liability. The man sitting closest to her, a serious-looking executive named Nathaniel Clark, finally looked up. His gaze was sharp, unreadable. "You've been with the airline for 15 years, he stated. "Not a single major complaint on your record." Meliora nodded stiffly. "That's correct." Nathaniel leaned back in his chair. "And yet, today, you made a call that resulted in you being removed from your own flight by corporate security." Meliora swallowed hard. It was a mistake. Nathaniel didn't blink. A mistake. Meliora kept her back straight. "I misjudged the situation." Nathaniel exchanged a brief glance with the woman sitting beside him, another executive, Amara Wells. She tapped a neatly manicured nail against the table. "We have to ask," Amara said, her voice smooth but firm. "Did you ask anyone else in first class to show their tickets?" Meliora hesitated. The silence stretched too long. Amara's expression didn't change. "That was a yes or no question." Meliora's hands tightened into fists beneath the table. "No." Nathaniel let out a small sigh, tapping the folder in front of him. "You didn't verify the manifest. You didn't check with the gate agent. You assumed that 2 unaccompanied young black boys in first class didn't belong there." He shut the folder. "That's not a mistake, Miss Cartwright. That's a decision." Meliora's mouth felt dry. I didn't mean—" "You did mean it," Amara cut in, "because you never questioned anyone else. You didn't pause. You didn't think twice. You saw them and decided." Meliora's breathing was uneven now. Nathaniel leaned forward. "You were one of the most senior flight attendants on that flight. That means you set the example. And today, the example you set was that rules only apply to some people." Meliora felt sick. For years, she had enforced rules, policies, and procedures without hesitation. But now she was the one sitting in front of people who had already decided her fate. Nathaniel exhaled. "We're still reviewing how this will be handled, but I can tell you this much. Your future with this airline is uncertain." Meliora felt a cold weight settle in her chest. Amara glanced toward the security officer standing by the door. "Escort Ms. Cartwright off the premises for now." Meliora's throat tightened. Not suspended. Not written up. Escorted. She was being removed from the building. Meliora stood slowly, her legs shaky. The security officer opened the door for her, waiting. The moment she stepped out, she wasn't just a flight attendant anymore. She was the woman who had humiliated the CEO's sons. And now, she was the one who didn't belong. The cold air outside the corporate office felt different as Meliora stepped out, her body stiff, her movements robotic. The weight of the last few hours settled over her like a crushing blanket. She had lost control of everything. The security officer, a middle-aged man with a neutral expression, didn't touch her, didn't say a word. But his presence was enough. He didn't have to escort her physically. The humiliation had already done its job. She stepped onto the sidewalk, blinking as the bright afternoon sun hit her face. The sounds of the city moved around her, cars honking, people walking past, their lives continuing as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't just watched her entire career crumble into dust. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. For a split second, she considered ignoring it. But then, curiosity won. She pulled it out, her heart plummeting when she saw the notification. Breaking news. Airline executive Darius Langford addresses first-class incident involving sons. Meliora's stomach twisted as she tapped the article. The first image she saw was of Darius Langford standing in the airport terminal, his sons on either side of him. The headline underneath it made her skin go cold. "No one should have to prove they belong where they already are." Her fingers trembled as she scrolled. The article detailed the entire incident, written in a calm yet damning tone. It described how 2 young, black passengers were removed from their first-class seats without proper verification, how the flight attendant responsible had been escorted off the plane, how the CEO of the airline had personally stepped in to ensure the situation was handled at the highest level. Then, at the very bottom, was a statement from Darius Langford himself. My sons did not need to prove their right to sit in first class. Their presence was enough. But someone on my airline, a place where fairness and professionalism should be absolute, chose to believe otherwise. This is not just about 2 passengers. It is about a culture that has allowed moments like this to happen over and over again, unchecked. That changes today. Meliora felt her stomach churn. Her name wasn't in the article. But it didn't have to be. Everyone who had been on that flight knew exactly who it was. And now, the entire world knew what she had done. She looked up from her phone, her breath uneven. A few feet away, near the entrance of the corporate building, a group of airline employees were standing in a circle, their heads bent over their phones. She didn't have to guess what they were reading. One of them looked up, her eyes meeting Meliora's for a fraction of a second. Then, without a word, she turned away. Meliora's chest tightened painfully. She had always prided herself on being respected, on having authority, on being someone people listened to. But now, she wasn't a leader. She wasn't a senior flight attendant. She was a headline, a cautionary tale, a name people would whisper about in break rooms. Her phone vibrated again, another news update. Meliora didn't check it. Instead, for the first time in years, she felt something she had rarely ever experienced. She felt small. She turned and walked away from the corporate office, her steps slower than they had ever been. And for the first time in 15 years, she had no idea where she was going next. Back at the Langford estate, the ride home was quiet, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Elian and Xavian sat across from their father in the back of the sleek black car, the leather seats cool beneath them. Their father hadn't spoken much since they left the airport, but he didn't have to. Elian checked his phone, scrolling through the news. They're all talking about it. Xavian grinned, kicking his feet up slightly. Good. Darius didn't react immediately. He simply rested his elbow on the car door, looking out the tinted window. After a long moment, he finally spoke. Are you satisfied? Xavian shrugged. Yeah, she got what she deserved. Darius finally looked at them. And what exactly did she deserve? Elian raised an eyebrow. She humiliated us. She didn't even think twice before kicking us off that plane. If you hadn't stepped in, she would have gotten away with it. Darius studied them carefully. That's not what I asked. The car fell silent. Xavian shifted slightly in his seat. She needed to learn. Darius nodded slowly. And now she has. He leaned back, his expression unreadable. But understand something. Both boys sat up straighter. Darius's voice was steady, deliberate. Power isn't just about what you can take from someone. It's about what you choose to do with it. Xavian frowned slightly. What do you mean? Darius sighed, rolling his shoulders slightly. That woman lost everything today. Not because you made it happen, but because she made a choice, and now she's dealing with the consequences. But there's something you both need to remember. Elian leaned forward. What's that? Darius met their eyes, his gaze unwavering. You don't need revenge when the truth speaks for itself. Another silence settled over them. Xavian exhaled, sinking into his seat. So, what happens now? Darius checked his watch. Now. We move forward. He glanced out the window again, watching as the city lights flickered past. I already told you, he murmured. No one should ever have to prove they belong where they already are. Xavian smirked. You should put that on a t-shirt. Darius chuckled, shaking his head. Not necessary. Elian smiled slightly. Why not? Darius closed his eyes briefly before answering. Because after today, he opened his eyes again, his expression unreadable. No one is ever going to forget it. The sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the city skyline as Darius Langford's car pulled into the driveway of their estate. The gates slid open without hesitation, and the vehicle moved smoothly down the long, tree-lined path leading to their home. Everything about their arrival felt normal, calm, controlled, and yet everything had changed. As the car came to a stop, Elian stretched his arms while Xavian let out a long breath, the energy of the day finally settling into his bones. It had been a victory, but one that came with weight. The three of them stepped out of the car. The air was crisp, carrying the distant hum of the city behind them. For the first time in hours, they weren't being watched. No more passengers, no more cameras, no more whispers. Just them. Inside, the familiar scent of cedarwood and faint cologne filled the entryway. Their home was a mix of modern elegance and warmth. High ceilings, sleek lines, but still inviting. This wasn't just a place where business deals were made. It was where they lived. Darius loosened his tie slightly, rolling his shoulders. He wasn't a man who carried exhaustion visibly, but today had been a rare exception. Today hadn't just been about his sons. It had been about something much bigger. Elian and Xavian exchanged a glance before following him into the spacious living room. Xavian flopped onto the couch. "So, she's done, right?" Elian sat down more slowly, setting his phone on the table. "Yeah," he said, quieter this time. "I think she knows that too." Darius remained standing, looking out through the floor-to-ceiling windows at the city stretching beyond their home. The lights flickered, cars moved below, and the world continued on. For everyone else, it was just another evening. But for Meliora Cartwright, her world had just collapsed, and he had made sure she felt it. Xavian smirked. "I kinda wish I could see her face right now." Darius exhaled slowly. "And what would that change?" Xavian blinked. "What?" Darius finally turned to face them, his expression unreadable. "What difference would it make if you saw her face, if you watched her regret it?" Xavian hesitated, shifting slightly in his seat. "I mean, it'd just be satisfying, that's all." Darius let out a quiet, knowing chuckle. "Satisfying?" He nodded, almost to himself, before taking a seat across from them. "You think what happened today was about satisfaction?" Elian leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. "It was about correction." Darius raised an eyebrow. "Was it?" Elian didn't back down. "She had power, and she used it to make us feel like we didn't belong. You made sure she understood that she was the one who didn't belong." Darius studied his son for a long moment before responding. "You're not wrong." Xavian crossed his arms. "Then what's the problem?" Darius sighed, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "The problem," he said, voice steady, "is that if all you take from this is the satisfaction of seeing someone fall, then you haven't learned anything at all." Xavian frowned slightly. "What else were we supposed to learn?" Darius leaned forward, his gaze steady. "Power isn't about revenge, Xavian. It's about responsibility." The room went silent. Darius continued. "You're going to go through life, and people will judge you before they know you. They will assume things, underestimate you, try to push you into corners where you have to prove yourself." His voice dropped slightly. "You will be questioned in rooms where you should be leading. You will be looked at like an outsider in spaces where you belong." Xavian and Elian listened carefully now. "And yes," Darius admitted, "sometimes those people will get exactly what they deserve. Sometimes the world will see them fall." He glanced out the window again before turning back to them. "But that's not what makes you powerful. What makes you powerful is the choice you make after you've won." Xavian sat back, thinking. "So what? We just forgive her?" Darius gave a small, quiet smile. "Number, you don't have to forgive her," he exhaled. "But you don't have to carry her with you either." Elian absorbed that, nodding slowly. "We move forward." Darius nodded. "Exactly." Xavian clicked his tongue. "So, no victory dance?" Darius smirked. "You can celebrate." Then his voice turned just slightly sharper. "But don't let your celebration turn into arrogance." Xavian rolled his eyes but grinned. "Fine, fine." Darius leaned back in his chair. "Now, tell me, what did you learn today?" Elian spoke first. "That people like her never think they're wrong, until they have no choice but to face it." Darius nodded. "Good." Xavian leaned forward. "That we don't need to prove we belong." Darius smiled slightly. Better. A lion sat up straighter. And that the best revenge is letting the truth do the work for you. Darius smiled fully now. Perfect. Xavian groaned. Ugh, why do you always make things so philosophical? Darius laughed. Because the sooner you understand how the world works, the sooner you learn how to navigate it. Elion stood, stretching his arms. I don't know about you, but I need food. Xavian hopped up after him. Oh yes, we deserve the best dinner ever for today's performance. Darius stood as well, shaking his head as his sons walked toward the kitchen. Arrogance, he muttered with amusement. Xavian turned around with a grin. No, Dad, confidence. Darius smirked. We'll see about that. The night stretched on, the city moving beyond their walls, the world continuing to turn. Today had been about justice, about power, about a lesson that wouldn't be forgotten. And as the Langfords sat down for dinner, the world outside was still talking. But none of them had to say a word, because after today, the message had already been received. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit the like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.